Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on metropolitan cities in the national fiscal and institutional structure, presented by Professor Paul Smoke. This webinar will address the important yet neglected issue of how urban public finance in developing countries are situated in the broader national fiscal, institutional, and political framework, and introduce metropolitan area coordination frameworks as a necessary condition to ensure effective metropolitan finance. This is the third one of our webinar series on planning and financing metropolitan governments. This series is the result of a collaboration between the World Bank and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and is structured around chapters of Lincoln Institute's recent publication titled Financing Metropolitan Governments in Developing Countries. It provides a unique entry point to engage cities who are addressing the complex task of financing infrastructure and services across jurisdictional boundaries. The webinar series will be held every other Tuesday from October 1st to 2013 to April 22nd, 2014. The list of topics could be found in our Institute website. We are very pleased to have Professor Paul Smoke as our speaker today. He is professor at Wagner Graduate School of Public Services, New York University. His research and policy interests include urban and regional development and the political economy of fiscal reform and public sector decentralization. He previously taught in the International Development Program and chaired the Master in City Planning program at MIT, and he worked as a resident policy advisor with the Harvard Institute for International Development in Kenya and Indonesia. Smoke is an affiliated scholar with the Center on International Development and Governance at the Urban Institute. Dr. Smoke has published in numerous journals, including World Development, Public Administration and Development, International Journal of Public Administration, Third World Planning Review, Regional Development Dialogue, Public Budgeting and Finance, Economic Development Quarterly, and Journal of Developing Areas. He has written or edited several books, the most recent of which are co-edited volumes, Decentralization in Asia and Latin America, Towards a Comparative Interdisciplinary Perspective, 2007, and Make Decentralization Work, Democracy, Development, and Security, 2010. He is currently co-editor of Public Administration and Development. Professor Smoke received his PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Paul Smoke to start his presentation.
Thank you very much, Vansha, and thanks everybody for joining us. I hope that you can hear me. Please let us know if you can. So, as Vansha said, this is part of a larger volume, and this particular chapter had a very specific place in that volume. I think that the people realize, based on experience and previous efforts to develop volumes on this topic, that effective metropolitan governance is very multifaceted and complex, and it depends on a set of global, national, and local conditions. And sometimes we just don't take this into account enough. We see a lot of problems with policy reform efforts that are very fragmented and specialized. They think that they're going to work on their own terms, and yet we know that other factors need to be in place for these kinds of reforms to develop. So the other problem that we face is that countries are very diverse. So you can't necessarily, and of course we all know this, but you can't necessarily take something that worked in one country and transplant it to another environment. And so the purpose of this chapter, and I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look at it, but it contains a lot of fairly dry details, and I'm not going to go through those details today. What I want to try to do is simply to provide a flavor of some of these larger issues that we need to be in tune with if we're going to have effective metropolitan governance and finance in developing countries. So I'm going to just give some illustrations and make a few wrap-up points, and then come back and see what you'd like to talk about. Again, this chapter focuses on national frameworks, not so much on the external global forces, which there are other chapters about, or specifically on the local dynamics, which again, there are other chapters in this volume about. So I want to say a few comments on, I think I already have explained why the policy frameworks matter, a little bit about the overarching policy framework, a few specific comments about the fiscal, and then a few things about governance, and then wrap it up. So I think that I've already said everything that's on this slide, except perhaps 2 points I want to emphasize. One is that this isn't an easy topic to study because the intergovernmental frameworks and systems are very different, and we tend to fall back and identify what is familiar to us. And so I think that we need to really think about this in a deeper way when we're working in a particular country. And the other thing, again, I think I've already said this, but to emphasize that the big issue is how the elements of the framework work together. You can have a great fiscal policy that's offset by governance or matters, or you can have a good governance policy that's offset by bad structures in the fiscal system. So given the diversity, what I tried to do in this chapter was not to generalize, but to take a set of countries, and they're listed here, you see they're from all around the world, and try to give a sense of how these framework issues play out in particular environments. So some of these countries are more rural, some are more urban, some have a lot of big urban areas, some don't. Some are unitary countries, some are federal countries, and so forth. So again, it's not intended to be a representative sample. It's a set of countries that I think illustrate interesting things. So the starting point in the differences that we need to be aware of, and sometimes when we're talking about cities specifically, we don't go back and think enough about the relationship of cities to other actors in the system. So in some of these countries, the point of this slide is that some have just a few levels of subnational government and others have more. Some of these levels of government are more closer to what we would consider to be truly devolved local governments with autonomous powers. Others are more under control of the center and would be considered deconcentrated. The two can exist in the same country. And some of them have the protection of constitutional rights, and others are simply made by administrative decision, which is more easily changed. In terms of the larger picture here, generally we do have stronger devolution in federal countries, but these federal countries tend to empower the state governments and worry less about the local governments. Some countries, and I've gone through, I'm not going to go through all the details here, but some of them empower intermediate tiers more than others, and other tiers, and some empower locals and sort of bypass the intermediate tier. Uganda doesn't even have provincial or state governments, and Ghana has unelected administrative regions, and South Africa has spheres of government. They don't even like to use the word tiers that imply a hierarchical relationship among the levels. Yet there are relationships that matter, as I'll come back to. The other challenge that we often face is that these policy frameworks are sometimes general enough that they're open to interpretation. And so things that maybe we think shouldn't happen in a decentralized system are able to happen because of the flexibility in the system. We've also seen some movement in the system where something on paper says that local governments have rights, which are later rolled back either formally or informally by the actions of the center, and this can affect local government performance. And in some of the federal countries, we see that the states have been the blockage to giving more power to local governments because of the nature of federal systems. And in some cases, there are, for large metropolitan cities or urban areas in general, some special provisions that give them additional powers. And these can be important as metropolitan governments are trying to pursue development strategies. So, a few points specifically about the fiscal framework. In the countries that we looked at in this chapter, they range, local governments range from being very unimportant to rather substantial. Now, the big issue here with expenditure assignment that sometimes I think we don't take enough into account is the degree to which functions are unique to a particular level. Does a city have control over particular expenditure functions, or is it either legally or by default or because there's another powerful level? Is it subject to a lot of interference, which interferes with their ability to be able to do the things that they need to do? One thing we do know in all of these countries, metropolitan or larger urban areas tend to provide more services, partly as a result of the framework, partly just because they have more functions and are seen to be more capable and have access to more resources. But this issue of who actually has responsibility for functions can be very important. Revenue is the same thing. All of these countries have some local sources, but some have more than others. And in many of these countries, the amount of resources that are collected locally is still fairly limited. Now, again, not always, but typically urban areas tend to be more fiscally independent from the national government. But this need not always be the case. And we do need to understand when we're looking at metropolitan fiscal policy, how much control do the urban governments actually have over their revenue base? There are also, of course, issues in the way that the transfers are shared. In some of these countries, there are shared specific taxes, and in most of them, the revenues are shared through pooled mechanisms that put resources from a number of revenue sources into a pool and then somehow share them by formula. These formulas can differ quite a lot across countries, and of critical importance for the governance and financing of metropolitan areas, how much conditionality is in place, both literally in the system and de facto because of the powers that are otherwise withheld from the local governments by higher levels of government or other important actors. Another issue is the stability of the pool. is the pool based on a rule, or is it on an annual budget decision, which one would expect to provide less stability of resources to the urban governments? And there are a few countries, I've given some examples here, that have specific transfer programs for urban areas. And then the last point on the fiscal framework is the borrowing. You know, we go around saying now this is a mantra in fiscal decentralization, in urban finance literature. Local government should borrow, but the borrowing frameworks are really quite different. And even though it's allowed in most of the countries that we looked at, there are actually some restrictions, some of which are positive restrictions that relate to ensuring that you have a fiscal responsibility framework in place, and others simply have to do with arbitrary decisions by higher levels of government that can prevent local governments, even large urban governments, from getting the resources that they need to meet their responsibilities. And I'm not going to go through all this here, but I put in this slide a set of examples of the different mechanisms that are used for local government lending in this set of countries. You see some of them are more publicly managed systems, some are a mix of public and private. In a few cases, larger cities, like in South Africa and India and others, are actually able to issue municipal bonds. And so the extent to which urban governments, which have these large capital needs, are able to tap into capital markets to meet these needs is heavily dependent on the institutional structures that are available and the efforts that the national government makes to allow, for example, pooled resources and so forth, which make municipal credit more readily available. So we really need to understand this, not just go in and say, oh, we should allow municipal bonds in this country. It's not always as easy as it seems. So the other set of national structures that I want to say just a few words about have to do with the processes of governance. And sometimes perhaps, especially public finance people, we don't take enough account of the role that these factors can play in the way that resources get used and the role that subnational governments, again, even in large urban areas, are able to play. So in all of the countries that we looked at here, there's some types of local elections, but in some countries, these elections are competitive and multi-party, and in others, there's really only one or two viable parties that really end up calling the shots. And even in competitive multi-party areas, there are clearly examples where having one party in power at a higher level and a different party in power at a lower level can affect the way that resources are managed and the ability of local governments to act independently. And in some of the less developed cases, you have situations in which, even though you have direct elections, the national government appoints people at the subnational level who end up actually being able to perhaps offset or neutralize some of the decisions that independently elected local governments would like to play. And we have to understand this if we're going to understand metropolitan finance and governance properly. The other set of issues has to do with the relationship among these levels. If where you have multiple subnational levels, how independent are the local governments, even the urban governments? How much do they have to work with provincial or state levels of government? How does this affect the way that they're able to discharge their responsibilities? And the issue of within metropolitan areas, is there a single metropolitan wide jurisdiction, or are there lower level jurisdictions or constituent jurisdictions at an equal level. And there's a lot of debate about what is the best way to do this, because we like, for large network infrastructure planning, to have a unified metropolitan administration. But we also know that these larger units are more politically distant from the constituents whose preferences are some of the important factors that drive the alleged benefits of fiscal decentralization. So, how do we get the balance right between having overarching jurisdictions that can deal with bigger network infrastructure where there are economies of scale and externalities involved, and still maintain a proper political connectivity and responsiveness to local government constituents, which is a critical matter for fiscal decentralization, for attaining the benefits of fiscal decentralization. Um, the other issues of subnational autonomy, we've talked a little bit about restrictions on revenue sources, conditions that may be placed on intergovernmental transfers, but there are also issues in terms of budgeting autonomy, in terms of the ability of subnational governments to hire and fire their staff. If they don't have that ability, what are the implications for their ability?
Hello, Paul. We lost you, Paul. Can you look at the microphone, please? Maybe the microphone was muted on top.
I just wanted.
Yeah, it's working.
Oh, it's working now. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. And then of course in the federal cases we have these issues. Anybody who works on India knows that some of the constraints on subnational finance come from the power that the state governments have over what happens below them. Now, Brazil partly dealt with this problem by giving some transfers directly to the municipalities that the states don't have a lot of control over. But again, these issues of how the various levels fit together can be really important. And I'm going to, because we're running out of time, I'm going to skip over these more detailed examples. But these are just a few examples of how these complex relationships on fiscal decisions interact with the political realities that exist on the ground and can affect the ability of urban governments to meet their responsibilities effectively. And there are a set of other things. I'm not going to be able to go through them in detail, but again, what kinds of transparency and civic engagement frameworks do we have, for example, and how does that affect the way that local people are able to discipline the behavior of their municipal governments, the role that the donors play, particularly in aid-dependent countries. So I'm going to have to wrap up fairly quickly so that we can open to some discussion. So the concluding point here, and again, I recognize this is a broad point that at some level we're all aware of, but in my view, we don't think about enough when we're working on our own corner of the universe, whether it's health delivery or metropolitan planning or transfers or property tax, that the ability of municipal governments, of urban governments to behave effectively depends on this fiscal, institutional, and political context, how they organize their intergovernmental systems, how much authority and autonomy local governments have, both on paper and in practice, and the kinds of accountability mechanisms that are in place. Again, the context is different. We can't generalize, but these things matter. We need to understand what are the legal functions and resources of metropolitan governments relative to other local and higher level governments. Are they territorially self-contained, or are they next to, do we have jurisdictional fragmentation? Are they next to other jurisdictional entities that ideally they need to be working with more closely in order to be able to provide more effective services and do their job better, raise revenue, be able to borrow, et cetera? What kinds of mechanisms exist to coordinate and create positive interaction among levels of government, both at the same level and at different levels? How do the elements of the fiscal system fit together, and how do other aspects of the national framework affect that? So you may have appropriate fiscal assignments in the Constitution or laws, but what happens if there are ways that other agencies at higher levels can interfere in that? What happens if there are ways that politics can be engaged in this? Shouldn't we know about these things in advance rather than discovering that these problems are there and are going to affect our ability to do the things that we want to do in the course of doing them? We should understand these things in advance. Yes, we need borrowing frameworks. Metropolitan government should borrow more. But if they don't have enough revenue autonomy, if there are generous transfers that prevent them, that create disincentives for them to be wanting to borrow, even for self-financing projects, then there are a set of issues that need to be dealt with. And then finally, on the accountability mechanisms, there are a number of issues here, but I think that it goes back to a few fundamental points. And one is that while we want autonomy for metropolitan governments to be able to do the things that they're supposed to be doing, both for the country and for their individual constituents, there's always going to be a role for higher level accountability. And I think that part of the big challenge here is getting the right balance between central standards and control and a sufficient amount of local autonomy. And perhaps for me, the most neglected thing in this whole field, and I think there's another chapter about this, is how these metropolitan governments interact with their constituents. Because you go back to the basics of fiscal decentralization, and a lot of the benefits are centered around the responsiveness of subnational governments to their constituents. And I think that we've tended to focus more in fiscal and institutional frameworks on upward accountability, the relationships between lower levels of government and higher levels of government, and so forth, and not enough on making sure that the conditions are in place for proper citizen feedback. Yes, we have participatory planning. Yes, we have participatory budgeting and so forth. But these things are often dealt with in a generic way. They're a bit mechanical. We think that sometimes I think we believe that there should be citizen participation about things that there probably shouldn't be citizen participation about. And we don't have citizen participation on things that we need more citizen participation on. So these elements of the accountability framework, upward and downward, are really critical if urban governments are going to be able to meet their responsibilities effectively. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you. I was asked to prepare a few questions, and the first one that I'm going to ask you is, what is typically the most important constraint on metropolitan government fiscal performance in developing countries? Is it A, constitutional or legal restrictions? B, central government regulation or control? C, a lack of resources? Or D, limited accountability? So it looks like we've got pretty heavy concern about central government regulation and control, a little bit of concern about the lack of resources and limited accountability. and in a few cases, I guess, constitutional or legal restrictions. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that the way I would answer this is that it really depends on the country. Any and all of these things can be relevant, but I do think that a lot of them come back. I would agree with the group sentiment here that a lot of these do come back to the way that central governments perhaps over-regulate resources and the behavior of local governments. I would also say, however, that in my experience, many municipal governments could do more than they actually do, and they use the central government control as an excuse for not doing more. So why don't we move on to the next question? This second question says, I think actually this is the third question, but that's okay. The most effective form of metropolitan governance is A, unified metropolitan administration, single metropolitan government with subdivisions, C, multiple jurisdictions within a metropolitan area, or D, none of the above. All right, none of the above. We got some work going on there. Okay. Wow, we're very conflicted on this answer, apparently. Well, I think that, yes, I think that I probably would agree with the sentiment being expressed here. I think that the issue here is subject to interpretation, right? Because I do think for certain functions you need to have a unified metropolitan administration. But getting back to that point that I made earlier, sometimes these big unified administrations can be so distant from constituents that there's some benefit in having lower levels within a unified metropolitan administration. And so I think that the issue becomes, what is it that a unified administration is responsible for, and what smaller, more neighborhoody type services can subdivisions provide? Now, the issue of multiple jurisdictions in a metropolitan area, I think it depends how you consider this, because obviously there are some benefits to having this, but if you have fragmentation and the units don't work together, so a classic example is the Manila Metropolitan Development Authority. You've got, I think, 16 or 17 cities and a municipality or two thrown in. And there is a unified body to try to get them to work together, but it doesn't work that effectively for a variety of reasons. So I think that you could have said any of these things as long as you understand. We need to understand in making policy, I think, that there are some things that need to be handled at a higher level. There are some things that a higher level maybe doesn't need to be involved in and can allow more citizen local government connectivity at lower levels. And if you're stuck with metropolitan fragmentation because of history and it's very difficult to get rid of existing units, then we need to think of a way to have mechanisms that create cooperation among the fragmented jurisdictions within a metropolitan area. So maybe we could move on to the final question. So metropolitan cities should generally receive special treatment in the fiscal and institutional frameworks of developing countries. A, true, B, false, C, not sure. Okay. Seems like people kind of go for this idea generally. I think I would agree with oh wow, unanimity. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we observe is in fact that there is often special treatment, even if it isn't formalized. I think it generally can be justified, but I do think that at the same time, what happens in some countries is that metropolitan areas get to do more what they want because they're bigger and more powerful, and there isn't enough attention paid to other jurisdictions. But I think generally speaking, we would expect metropolitan areas to behave differently because they can and should provide more services, and they probably ought to have more autonomy, and they probably need access to a greater variety of sources of revenue. So I think with that, our questions are done, and Mancha, I think we can move on to the chat.
Thank you, Professor Smoke, for trying to cover this important and comprehensive topic within such a short period. Let's now open for questions. Please type your question in the chat pod. Maybe I can start with a question. Professor Smoke, you mentioned the fragmentation with the Manila Metropolitan Authority. I would like to hear whether you have some recommendation how they can overcome this barrier.
Well, I think that it is a complicated matter because I think there are a number of things. One is that when you've got independent political jurisdictions like that, there has to be a reason for the elected mayors to think beyond the needs of their own constituents. And of course, in situations where people are elected into these positions, they're going to mostly be concerned about their own constituents. So I think one issue is how do you create a sense of among the individual jurisdictions that by working together they can work more effectively, that they can develop some projects together by pooling resources. It will be cheaper for them, that it's not good for one jurisdiction to have a good road that stops at a boundary and goes into a bad road and so forth. So part of it, I think, is awareness among leaders, but part of it is awareness among citizens, how it affects them, and then they can put more pressure on the local governments to behave in a different way. Part of it, I think, is that is also a generic factor is how does can the national government create incentives through the way that it finances projects and so forth to get these individual entities to work together better. And I think that's something that needs to be thought of more in the Philippines and other countries like that. And then the third thing that is how to repackage an entity that has a lot of historical baggage, because the Manila Metropolitan Development Authority was set up by an authoritarian regime. It was set up under the Marcos administration, and so it has that historical baggage associated with it, and it's a central government rather than a voluntary local government mechanism. But without the finance mechanisms, it's mostly funded by the central government rather than by contributions from the local governments, the constituent local governments. And so I think that it's a combination of public relations, of incentives that come from the national level, of factors that would create more awareness among the elected leaders as well as among the citizens.
Thank you. And there's a question raised by Norbert. In the Republic of Kosovo, the government is considering a special fiscal arrangement for the capital Pristina, 4% more share in the block grant. The city is under high development pressure and is an employment magnet. That requires, of course, more funds for services. How is this typically done in other countries?
Well, I have seen only a few, and there's some examples in the paper of uh, dedicated transfer programs to large urban governments. Um, the I have not seen situations in which there is a specific transfer dedicated just to the national capital. I think that I mean I guess I'd have to know a little bit more about the current state of the transfer system to know whether I would have a particular idea about how to structure the resources there. But I do think that one can make a case on economic development grounds alone to put additional resources into a major capital city that is a magnet for job creation.
Thank you. A question from Peter. Paul, great presentation. Thank you. Many of the metro areas, especially primate cities, typically do not have the need for or receive transfers as much as does smaller local governments. Borrowing aside, should we focus here on improved own source revenue along with improving planning and investment priorities? Should we get them away from looking for transfers?
But I think that transfers are going to be important. Even in the industrialized countries, there's transfers for a lot of major infrastructure. For me, the issue, I mean, one can quibble in a particular case about how much transfers there should be, but for me, this is an important question about the way the elements of the system come together, because I think that we generally haven't done a very good job of creating incentives for revenue generation in the transfer system. And so the issue is not so much the balance between transfers and own source revenues, but how you make sure that you structure the transfers in a way that they're not going to just be seen as handouts and that they undermine local revenue generation. And the other thing about the transfers, I mean, again, it depends on the country. If you're talking about India, the big metropolitan corporations, they can issue bonds now. But the question is, what are the incentives that are created in the transfer system for borrowing? Because I've actually seen this a lot, where uh, cities that could afford to borrow, whose national frameworks allow them to borrow, they don't because they're getting transfers. So it's important that the transfer be set up in such a way, I think, that there be incentives, that you don't create disincentives for large fiscally capable cities, particularly which are borrowing for revenue generating infrastructure, to be relying on handouts from the central government when they could be borrowing as well. So I don't know if that answers Peter's question, but I think that it's about getting the balance right and getting the incentives in the way the elements of the metropolitan fiscal structure fit together.
Any more questions? Maybe I'll ask another question here, taking advantage. We actually heard from in South Africa. We actually heard from the national government that they have actually set aside quite a lot of funding that will be available for the local governments to use. But the question is that a lot of local government doesn't have the capacity to identify the needs in terms of investment and use those funds so I would like to ask if you have any recommendations on that and how to address the capacity issue.
Mhm. Well, I think there's a number of things that you can do. I mean, first of all, I think in South Africa, the issue is not so much with the big metro areas. They spend a lot of the money on infrastructure. They also do the vast majority of the borrowing, and they have the capacity to deal with a lot of the responsibilities that they're given by the Constitution and the legislation. So I think the issue becomes more with the smaller municipalities, and there I think that it becomes incumbent on the central government to be able to set up the kinds of assistance that they need in order to be able to program properly. But one of the challenges I think in South Africa is that the even though there is a requirement for metropolitan planning, there some of the service responsibilities are still a bit fragmented, and there's various kinds of involvement from the provincial and national levels. So I think that there needs to be a strategy for how you enable the local governments to be able to provide the things that they can provide, and then to be able to provide them the support that they need to develop the capacity to deal with the others. In the case of the metros, I think that the government has recognized the problem that has plagued them, which is that they haven't had enough power over the spending of resources in certain key sectors. And so you're starting to see a situation in which more specific legislation is being passed that is giving more power, for example, over transportation to the metropolitan local governments. And so this is another way of saying this is that what you really need in a country like South Africa and in many countries is an asymmetric approach to the way that you deal with the local governments. You give the bigger, more capable ones access to more resources, more autonomy in how to do things, and with the others, you are going to have to be a little bit more careful about giving resources which aren't going to be well spent and tailoring their assumption of responsibilities to capacity building that is specifically targeted to new functions that they should eventually be able to take on. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my shot at it.
Thank you. If anybody has more question, please type. Okay, a question from Peter again. Given your replies, should we differentiate transfer system to be different for the largest metros? The one-size-fits-all typically means that the bias is for equalization and towards smaller municipalities. Or is this too complicated for the center to manage? Set rules versus discretion.
Well, I think that discretion on the part of national governments in terms of how they allocate transfers can be rather problematic. I mean, we've seen many examples of how that's been politicized in the past, which is why we've moved more towards recommending formula-based transfers. Now, there are a couple of things about that. Uh, you can differentiate the types of transfers where one type is going to be more redistributional, and it deals with the fiscal disparities among local governments, and of course that is going to be biased against the big urban governments because they're able to raise more money. But you can also still have particular types of transfers which are aimed at, for example, major urban transport or water systems of a certain type and quality and so forth that would provide additional resources for big infrastructure planning for urban areas. And these can be conditional in, broadly speaking, in the sense that they have to be focused on particular types of infrastructure, but they can still leave a lot of discretion to the urban authorities in terms of how they program that, which roads they target, and so forth. And my caveat again on this is that if you're going to have those types of transfer systems, that there need to be built into these transfers something that ensures reasonable performance by the urban authorities that are receiving them, both in terms of revenue generation, as we talked about before, in terms of not discouraging borrowing where it is feasible to borrow, and perhaps also more of the new generation of output-based performance transfers in terms of thinking about future allocations, how these things would all fit together. We don't have a lot of evidence on these performance-based transfers so far, but there seems to be a lot of experimentation going on, and I think this is a productive way to try to ensure better performance with the use of the resources without unduly restricting the autonomy of the urban governments that would be making decisions about what to spend it on.
Thank you, Paul. Let's take a last question from Fabio. In Brazil, the fiscal responsibility law constrains subnational governments, which will only be able to borrow resources from multilateral organizations and commercial banks, including public ones. After more than a decade under those constraints, the country suffers from infrastructure bottlenecks and lack of resources to address them. Taking into account that many local governments improved their fiscal stance, would it be a good idea to allow major subnational governments to issue debt in global markets?
Yes, I have a few Brazilian friends or friends who've worked on Brazil, and they have different opinions about this. I mean, my own view is that that probably what has happened in Brazil. I mean, we all know why the fiscal responsibility law was developed to begin with in the context of a fiscal crisis. It does feel to me, I am not an expert on Brazil, like sometimes when you allow too much freedom and something goes wrong, there's a tendency for national governments to then excessively restrict freedom, and I think that that at some point in time you need to go back and look again and think about relaxing the conditions and restraints. And my guess is that this is probably something that could be done in Brazil. I guess the one thing I would go back to the idea of asymmetry. I mean, I think that you do have to be careful about perhaps after having gone too far in this direction and then maybe too far in the other direction, about going back too far in the other direction again. So having some type of entry criteria, some conditions that would need to be met. I mean, of course, once you get to the free market model, you've got bond ratings and credit ratings and so forth. But as you're getting to that stage for municipalities that may not quite have the fiscal strength to do that, how do we go back to setting up mechanisms that can reward the local governments that deserve more freedom and more credit access than they've had in the past, without opening the door in a way that you create some of the very problems that you're trying to avoid. So that's my cautious, judiciously worded answer to your question.
Thanks, Paul. I'm afraid we will have to wrap up now, and I would like to thank Professor Smoke again for your excellent presentations. Thank everyone for joining us and asking questions. Please feel free to send us further comments or questions. And also please take a few minutes to complete the survey at the end of the webinar to help us improve this. I would also like to remind you that our next webinar is on November 12th on the decentralization of governance in metropolitan areas by Professor Roy Bao. We look forward to seeing you again. With that, let me hand over to Paul for his final words to conclude the webinar.
Well, I guess I would just say, that this is a tough topic to cover in 20 minutes, and I wasn't trying to make any specific points about you should always do this or always do that. In fact, quite the opposite. The simple point here is that countries are very different, that we need to understand these differences, but we all need to learn to move beyond our comfort zones and look at how the elements of reform that we're working on link to other pieces of the system which need to be in place for effective performance. So if we work on transfers, if we work on participatory budgeting, we need to understand how that thing that we're working on fits in this larger structure. And there's no right or wrong answer for what you should do, but we all need to do our homework better in a way that will allow us to recommend, develop, implement more effective policies for metropolitan governance and finance.